So the first thing I want to say is it might feel a little bit odd to turn our attention to ourselves. You know, we're often, as therapists, we think a lot about how there's, and as people, we think about how there's so much suffering in the world and there's so much of our focus is on helping others, including those in our families and our communities and the world at large. And I'm mindful of that perspective. However, as important as it is to help others, I think all of us as clinicians also understand the importance of finding joy in our own lives and helping our clients find joy in their lives. And with that being said, in order to maximize that joy and to gain the most meaning from our lives, it's essential to develop self-compassion, because every moment you spend knowing and loving and accepting yourself is going to add to the meaning and joy that you can experience in life. So I hope that we can keep that in mind in our discussion today. And so before moving ahead with this topic, though, I just want to give you a little bit more background on myself and tell you about how I came to have an interest in this topic. So like Dean said, I did my undergraduate degree in psychology and education at UCLA. And then after that, I taught elementary school for 2 years in South Central Los Angeles. And then I did my graduate work in University of Washington, got my master's degree there, and I went to Child Protective Services for a couple of years after that, and in the San Francisco Bay Area. And after that, I kind of felt, I don't know, a call to see if I could merge some of my interests in like direct practice with theory. And so I found this really great program that I felt kind of merged all of my interests in development and psychology and education all together. And that was at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, which was in human development and psychology. So I went there and I had a long journey in my program. And my journey culminated in my dissertation, which took me in a different direction than I originally set out in. I wanted to go into risk and prevention in childhood and do kind of, you know, large-scale interventions and things like that. And I ended up really doing a lot of introspective work and thinking about my identity as a Mormon woman, as we called it at the time, Latter-day Saint now. But I did my dissertation on Latter-day Saint women who experienced parental divorce in childhood and adolescence, and I looked at how they talked about different doctrinal concepts, specifically gender roles and eternal families. And so I looked at how these women talked about it in kind of in comparison to how they were in terms of their own adult development, how embedded they were in seeing the world through their own cultural perspective versus how able they were to kind of step outside and reflect upon it. So that was what my dissertation was about. And after that, I have done some academic teaching. I spent a lot of time in private practice. And before recently, last year, August 2018, I came to UVU, and I got a great opportunity to come there. And I teach courses primarily in the Master of Social Work program. And so my interest in the topic of self-compassion developed over the past few years after I started working more with women, especially, who struggled with having a low self-concept. And so a lot of my clients I noticed, and maybe I noticed this kind of exacerbated and even more pronounced in some of my Latter-day Saint female clients, just noticed a lot of like negative self-talk and just really low self-concept that was kind of emerging and a lot of conflict that was emerging. And so I would try to, utilize, cognitive behavioral techniques. I would teach them basic skills to address negative self-talk, and that felt woefully inadequate a lot of the time because it kind of kept coming back to these core emotions that were behind the self-talk. It was frustrating for years. Like, how do you get at those? How do you get at that? Like, you can sort of teach someone how to talk to themselves differently and how to, make a list of their strengths and all that. But how do you teach someone to address kind of that core feeling inside of I'm not good enough and nothing I ever do is going to be good enough? And that really stuck with me a long time. And I kind of worked with it in kind of an acceptance sort of way, like, okay, well, we can accept that we feel this way, and then we can move towards, not feeling that way. And then I heard about the concept of self-compassion. So about late spring of 2016, I ran across a piece in the Atlantic magazine, and Dr. Kristen Neff, out of University of Texas, Austin, associate professor in human development there, she was being interviewed about the concept of self-compassion, which she has done work on for many, many years. And she argues that it's more effective for long-term mental health to focus on developing self-compassion rather than improving one's self-esteem. And she made a strong differentiation between the two concepts, which we're going to get into a little bit. So I delved more into learning about self-compassion, and I bought her book, and I've started practicing these principles more with my clients. And it's really been revolutionizing for me in the way that I work with clients and the way that I think about these issues in my own daily life. And so today I hope that I can share some of these concepts with you, and I hope that you can apply them as well. So just to go over a couple things, I kind of talked about my interest in self-compassion, so I want to go over what is self-compassion, some of the core components of self-compassion, talk about the benefits, and then self-compassion versus self-esteem, and talk a little bit more about those differences. Talk about what prevents self-compassion. And then my students, I'm going to turn it over to them, and they're going to talk more specifically about self-compassion and Latter-day Saints in this culture in particular. And then we can talk a little bit about how Latter-day Saints cultivate self-compassion. We're going to give a couple of anecdotes from our own lives about our experience in this particular culture, Latter-day Saints kind of culture, and how we've been able to be met with perspectives that have helped us develop self-compassion, and also some experiences that have really kind of inhibited abilities to develop self-compassion. And then we're starting a study involving Latter-day Saint women and self-compassion at UVU. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that research before we end, that proposed research. So what is self-compassion? So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to read you an excerpt from Dr. Neff's book where she kind of frames this really nicely. So she talks about the cost of self-judgment. Continually feeding our need for positive self-evaluation is a bit like stuffing ourselves with candy. We get a brief sugar high, then a crash, and right after the crash comes a pendulum swing to despair as we realize that, however much we'd like to, we can't always blame our problems on someone else. We can't always feel special and above average. The result is often devastating. We look in the mirror and don't like what we see, both literally and figuratively, and the shame starts to set in. Most of us are incredibly hard on ourselves when we finally admit some flaw or shortcoming. I'm not good enough. I'm worthless. It's not surprising that we hide the truth from ourselves when honesty is met with such harsh condemnation. In areas where it is hard to fool ourselves, when comparing our weight to those of magazine models, for instance, or our bank accounts to those of the rich and successful, we cause ourselves incredible amounts of emotional pain. We lose faith in ourselves, start doubting our potential, and become hopeless. Of course, the sorry state just yields more self-condemnation for being such a do-nothing loser, and down, down we go. And even if we do manage to get our act together, the goalposts for what counts as good enough seem always to remain frustratingly out of reach. We must be smart and fit and fashionable and interesting and successful and sexy, oh, and spiritual too. And no matter how well we do, someone else always seems to be doing it better. The result of this line of thinking is sobering. Millions of people need to take pharmaceuticals every day just to cope with daily life. Insecurity, anxiety, and depression are incredibly common in our society, and much of this is due to self-judgment, to beating ourselves up when we feel we aren't winning in the game of life. Another way. So what's the answer? To stop judging and evaluating ourselves altogether. To stop trying to label ourselves as good or bad and simply accept ourselves with an open heart. To treat ourselves with the same kindness, caring, and compassion we would show to a good friend, or even a stranger for that matter. Sadly, however, there's almost no one whom we treat as badly as ourselves. So that's just her take on what self-compassion is. So, with that being said, before I get into the self-compassion, all of you, or a lot of you, some of you kind of walked in late, I passed out a little questionnaire, a little short form measure of what self-compassion is, or how self-compassionate you are in your life. So what I'd like for you to do is just take a minute. If you have a pen, great, fill it out. You don't have to score it right now, although the scoring directions are there. We're not going to go through all the scoring right now. I just want you to take a second and do this just so you can have an idea of kind of how you stand in reference to some of these things. Self-compassion. So let's take like a minute and you can do that. So does anyone have any insights from just kind of going through this, or what kind of is coming to your mind as you're kind of thinking about this in terms of yourselves? Hey.
Well, I just think this is the universal problem. Everyone struggles with this stuff.
Yeah.
Certainly all clients do, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was noticing that as I was starting to do it, I couldn't go all the way to a 1 or a 5 because there's always room for improvement. There's always more I can do, right? So I just started thinking, okay, wait a minute, let's add some self-compassion here, not be so worried that you're not enough, and even feeling this out to what my expectations think I should be.
I mean, the first time I did this exercise, I've just, because I can think of myself as like, okay, I'm a therapist. I'm trying to be more self-compassionate. I'm trying to model that. But then when you actually sort of see it there in black and white, you realize that, okay, this is something that I need a lot of work. I need to do a lot of work in this area myself. And I think, as was said back here, most of us probably do. So I just wanted you to do that exercise so you could kind of keep these things in mind. So we already completed that self-compassion scale. So what is self-compassion? So there's 3 key components. And one is self-kindness. And that's defined in terms of using kind words to talk to ourselves and talking to ourselves the way a good friend would. So it's more about and this is actually very, very helpful with a lot of my clients when I can bring up okay, you're being really hard on yourselves right now. This is how you're talking to yourself. Think of someone who really, really cares about you, who really just has your back. What do you think that person would say to you in this situation? So Kristen Neff talks a lot about this, how can you reframe whatever you're thinking about, whatever you're kind of being really hard on yourself, chastising yourself about, and how can you turn that around and think of the way that someone else who really loved you and cared about you, what they would say. The second component here is called common humanity, and that's just recognizing that we are part of the common whole. Instead of seeing ourselves as the other, seeing ourselves as part of the human family, where everyone is imperfect. And a lot of us can think of examples here. Dr. Neff gives a great one. She's talking about her son who has autism. And she often shares this anecdote of her son playing in a park, and she sees this group of moms over, and all their kids are quote unquote normal. And she sees her, son oh, I can never relate to these moms over here because they don't know what it's like. They never want their kids to be around my kid, and we're just too far apart. And then she kind of took a step back and just realized, what, I'm not being very self-compassionate here because I'm really kind of keeping myself apart. And just reframed and said, all these moms, they're all struggling with something. Everyone has something. Maybe they don't have an autistic child, but everyone has something that they struggle with. That is the human condition, that we all struggle with something. So helping clients, helping ourselves see that we're part of this common humanity, where struggle is a universal thing that we go through. And just because you have something that you're going through, and maybe even if it's a unique challenge, we all have something that we're struggling with. We all have some way that we feel apart. And the third component is mindfulness, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with in here, but how that's defined is taking a balanced approach to emotions so that feelings are neither suppressed nor exaggerated. So it refers, we cannot ignore our pain and feel compassion for it at the same time. Mindfulness requires that we not over-identify with thoughts and feelings so that we are caught up and swept away by negativity. The clear seeing and non-judgmental acceptance of what is occurring in the present moment. So the first is Neff's definition. The second is from Brene Brown, describing Neff's work. So she talks about the identifying over-identification or distorting reality of feelings, getting really caught up in things and seeing them as worse than they objectively are. My 10-year-old daughter does this a lot. She says, things like, if she does something wrong and she gets a consequence, fine, I'm never gonna have the iPad again, ever in my whole life. That's sort of very black and white, kind of going to never or always. when you focus on the fact that you're having certain feelings, she says you're no longer like lost in the storyline of them. You can step back and see them like an observer. And mindfulness allows responding rather than reacting. So she talks about being an observer. And there's this exercise in her book that she talks about noting practice, like practicing just sort of noting what you're feeling in your daily life, just noting different things that you're feeling and not necessarily judging them, but just noting it. And so she's talking about picking an activity also to be more mindful and present and aware of, like choosing one thing at a time at first to start noting, and then gradually moving to being more mindful in different areas of our lives. So some of the benefits of self-compassion. So less anxiety and depression. So people who are more self-compassionate tend to be less anxious and depressed. And it might not be causal, but there is research, and a lot of the studies are cited in her book, that suggest that a self-compassionate mindset might reduce depression and anxiety. Because once our minds latch on to negative thoughts, we tend to get stuck there and ruminate. And women tend to do this much more than men, and it might be more physiology, but also perhaps culture and power differentials between gender. We have less fear of evaluation when we're more self-compassionate. So self-compassionate can also teach us to generate positive emotions through acceptance of negative emotions. So she talks a lot about also self-compassion versus self-esteem. So self-esteem is an evaluation and a judgment that we are good and worthy. And she talks about this as being more rooted in kind of this idea of competition. We've sort of spent this whole generation teaching children they need to have a higher sense of self-esteem. We give everyone a trophy now. And it's very, very rooted in this idea that like you have to like be good at something. And you have to judge yourself good and worthy based on some sort of external factor. There's nothing wrong with being confident. The trouble is how we try to achieve higher self-regard. Often is by undermining others or comparing our achievements to those around us. That's not just unsustainable, it can also lead to narcissism or depressive bouts during hard times. Self-esteem is highly contingent on success in domains such as appearance. Self-compassion is better because it allows you to accept that sometimes you're average and that's okay. It is part of the human condition to be good at some things, bad at others, and average in many dimensions. So she actually has this exercise that I really like, and I've had some clients do it before, where you kind of write down things that you're really, really good at, things that are really huge aspects of strengths in your life. And then you can also list like things that you're just sort of okay at. Like, what are you sort of okay at in your life? And what are you really bad at? What do you really suck at? Like, all of us have those things, right? We're all a mixed bag, every single one of us. So it's not just about like, how can you like be the best? Because not all of us are going to be the best. Not all of us are going to like, be number one. There's always going to be someone who's going to be better than you at some measure. But how can we just accept that we are all a mix of the good and the bad and the average, and that that's okay? That is part of the human condition. So things that prevent self-compassion. Perhaps personality. Perhaps you're born with certain traits that lead you to be more anxious or depressed or more inclined to compare yourselves to others. Maybe you have earlier life experiences. Maybe there's some critical parenting that's happened. Maybe you've been given messages that you are not good enough or that you always need to get better. Or maybe there's culture. Cultural messages can lead to self-criticism and feelings of worthlessness. So what messages do you think in our larger culture, not even like Latter-day Saint culture, but what about larger culture do you think might inhibit self-compassion? What are things that we just hear? Yes?
Well, there's a constant competitiveness, and it's very helpful in many ways where people try harder, work harder, but to find that balance between I'm motivated by wanting to do well and to enjoy healthy competition versus destructive competition. So if that's your only measurement of competition, then as you said, there will always be someone better in some way. So you never are good enough.
So there is this kind of focus on like the need to achieve, the need to like reach higher rungs of the ladder, and that can be emphasized in different arenas or different areas in different, depending on where you live or where you are. Like I know in Boston where I was, the whole academic achievement was really highly emphasized. And here it might be something different, a little bit that might be not quite as emphasized as other things. There might be some areas where it's material success or your appearance, how thin, how fit you are. Was there a hand over here?
So we have a culture of being able to get your own television show depending on how...
Yeah, reality TV.
Towards others.
How famous you are.
We also have a culture of you can have a very confident child initially who has teachers or instructors who are not confident and then are threatened by confidence of someone. So they actually train them down.
Right.
You're not supposed to be able to work at your capacity or something.
Right. Thank you. Is there another hand? A couple hands. You and then we'll...
The old phrase, do or do not, there's no try.
Right.
Now just to have an experience, you have to do it all whether you do it right or not.
Mm-hmm. Really great point. Like some of those, those are messages. That's in the popular culture. That's like Star Wars,
I would say not meeting cultural milestones would be really hard for people. So serving a mission, getting married.
Right.
Maybe you end up divorced, and that can be really hard.
So here, we're going to talk about that in terms of like Latter-day Saint culture. So that's really great. Was there one more? Couple hands over here. Yeah.
If you're not always pushing yourself, you lose your edge.
Right. Right.
I see a lot of adolescents and the expectation of perfectionism is overpowering.
Right. Yeah.
And they are not.
Right. Feeling very, especially when you think about human development, when you think of like, more kind of like still like black and white thinking, before we kind of transition to being more abstract and more nuanced and able to kind of take into account like lots of different layers of experience. There can be a very kind of black and white, all or nothing kind of mindset. So there also might be this sort of fear of laziness and self-indulgence. One of these things that might prevent self-compassion is that like, hey, I've got to be hard on myself. I'm never going to achieve unless I'm hard on myself. Like unless I like crack the whip, I'm not going to, that's actually more self-love to like be hard on myself, right? And what I really got out of this is that self-criticism, I really love this work because it talks about how self-criticism is thought to be a motivator, but it actually is associated with increased depression and anxiety. And it can be a good motivator in the short term. But really in the long term, she talks about how it's rooted in fear and self-compassion is rooted in love. And how long-term love is really more of a, stronger motivator than fear. Yeah.
So I was going to say social media tends to press all of these very rigorous.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes.
So I just see a link between what you're explaining and perfectionism, which has a lot of the same, there's a lot of connection there because it's the same idea. It works for a while, it looks good for a while, but then, you fall back into isolation.
Right.
The problems that are associated with perfectionism. I think that this would probably be a parallel experience.
Right.
Self-criticism.
Right. Yeah, and this is, all of this, this is just kind of and I knew kind of all this stuff, but this just sort of put it together in a very nice way for me because I was able to have a language to say to my clients, to say, look, you're thinking that you can't feel good about yourself until you achieve something. But really, like, you might not ever achieve something. You might have circumstances in your life, you might just not ever be able to be what you're wanting to be. And so really, you're not going to feel good about yourself unless you learn to have some self-compassion, unless you learn to accept yourself, be mindful, be kind to yourself. So we practice more doing that. Yes?
A talk from a long time ago that I read, it's called How Not to Talk to Your Children. And it encourages praising your children for efforts instead of praising them for their achievements. Instead of saying, oh, you are so smart, you're so smart. Instead of saying, I can see how hard you worked on this. You really put a lot into this.
Right.
Because if you're praising them for their achievements, then they might get to a place where they don't want to try because what if they're not perfect?
Right, exactly. And so that's kind of really what a lot of this is about, like cultivating more of a mindset where we can accept that, hey, you know what, everyone is a mixed bag. And that is the kind of parenting philosophy I've tried to incorporate. Like, okay, you're really good here. This is something we still need to work on and it's okay. So now I'm actually going to turn the time over to my two students who are going to talk specifically about cultural messages within the Latter-day Saint culture about self-compassion. So
where's the clicker? Okay. So I'm Karina Wolf, and I am just going to talk about the three concepts of self-compassion, the three main concepts: mindfulness, and common humanity, and self-kindness, and how they relate to our LDS culture specifically. So culture is really the lenses we see. I'm just going to put the whole thing because I can't. The lenses we see our world through, right? What is acceptable in some cultures, it's not acceptable in another. I am from Brazil, and if you bring a Jell-O with fruit in it and call it salad, it's definitely not acceptable there. People are going to think you need to go talk to somebody. But it's definitely acceptable to hug and kiss as you approach somebody. It's actually expected, not just acceptable, but expected. In some cultures, we have our bubble. We have, our personal space. So we have that affecting our, the lenses that we see our culture, what's acceptable or not. And there's a study, the Gallup study, I think from 2018, reported that Utah is the 5th highest stress state. 44.6% of people reported being stressed. So I thought that was really interesting. Another study showed that high self-criticism, this was particularly with Asian culture, equals lower self-compassion. The more self-critical you are, the less self-compassion that you have for yourself. And Dr. Lafkas talked about that. In America, I'm going to say we because I feel like I'm kind of like that. We don't like being average. We redefine the bell curve. Average is not good. We want to be above average, right? So, and all of a sudden, there's no more really average anymore. Okay, so from talks, scriptures, doctrines, we have a lot of messages in our LDS culture that promote self-compassion, that promote self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. We learn from scriptures and talks about that Christ did an infinite atonement. That's really a core of our values. Because of that, forgiveness is possible. So I can be forgiven from my sins as well. We learn that we are loved unconditionally by Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ. No matter what we do, how we do it, we are still loved by Him. We also learn that sharing stories make us feel connected with one another and not alone. And we also can have kindness when we find kind leaders and bishops, especially bishops, where we can share our sins and transgressions with, and we receive love and no judgment from them. With common humanity, we are all brothers and sisters. We learned that in the scripture, right? We have that human family. We talk about in our wards how we have our ward family and so forth. We mourn with those that mourn. We suffer with those that suffer. I don't know as I was thinking about this, I don't know any other religion. I am a convert, so even in my previous religion, I don't know any other religion that serves as much as we do. Not just in our ward, in our community, but in the world in general. We send our missionaries out at 18 years old to serve. We donate, we give our time, so we serve one another. And we are taught that we make mistakes, and that's okay. And that's just fine. And we all fall short. that promotes common humanity. In terms of mindfulness, we do that almost weekly, at least, right? Through sacrament. That you need to be still, unless that you have 2-year-olds with you. But usually you are still and introspective and thinking about your week or what happened. We are encouraged to go to the temple as often as possible. We pray, we sing hymns. Even during family home evening, that can be a time for mindfulness activities. We express gratitude for our trials and for our tribulations. In order to do that, we have to be taking the time to think about, what did I learn from this? What is this trial teaching me? Have you ever heard anybody expressing gratitude for a trial in the pulpit? I have. So you can't just express without really meaning, without thinking, what is this? What am I supposed to learn from this? So that promotes mindfulness. And we are taught that answers to prayers comes through that still small voice. And in order to do that, we need to practice mindfulness. Sometimes that's in a temple, sometimes that is at home, sometimes that's in a church. However that is, it's that time for yourself, that time for just you and your mind to stay still. The same way that we have a lot of messages, doctrines, scriptures that promote self-compassion, we also have messages that get taken out of context and that are less conducive to self-compassion. And we talked about perfection. That's my all-time favorite. That's what I'm doing. My capstone is in the LDS culture specifically, because it is a problem. We compare and we compete, and we compare and we compete, and it's never enough. And it will never be enough, because somebody else will always be doing better, will always be having more. So that creates a lot of self-judgment, right? We learn from scriptures that some sins are hard to be forgiven, and some may not even be forgivable. So what does that mean to me? Are my sins not forgivable? Maybe my sisters and my brothers, their sins are okay, but not mine. That increases our self-judgment. That increases our that culture of less compassion towards ourselves. In preparation for this, I actually watched a video on Mormon. Is it still called Mormon.org? Anyways, about this woman talking about how her sin, she was suffering because she's a sinner. And she deserved to suffer because she was a sinner. And I thought that to be so interesting. So despair sometimes comes of iniquity. So if I am suffering, it's because I am a sinner. That's self-judgment, right? And we have this idea in our LDS culture that we have that same path. We grow up in the church, we get our medallion, or what is it, the Scout? Eagle, thank you. The Eagle. I got baptized when I was 18. We get married in a temple. We have children. We stay at home. Our children go to missions, and we all live happily ever after. Right? But that's not the path for everybody. We all have different paths. So that promotes the idea of, well, if that's not my path, what is wrong with me? Something must be wrong with me. That creates a lot of self-judgment. A lot of things that also increases our isolation, guilt, shame, not disclosing our sins because I don't want to be shamed. I don't want to feel guilty because I'm the only one that suffers. And the last one that I really want to touch on It's our brothers and sisters in the LGBTQ community that feel alone, that feel isolated because they don't feel they have a place among us. They don't feel that they have a place in heaven. And that it's very detrimental and very isolating for them. So all those messages that we hear can be less conducive to our own self-compassion. And I'm going to turn over the time to Vary.
So the next part that we want to talk about is some specific ways in your practice or with the people that you work with, how you can, some practical ways, some ways that you can incorporate the gospel in with this idea of self-compassion. So the first way is that we're going to talk about is emphasis on individual worth. So this is something that a lot of young women will have gotten, and it can be really helpful in encouraging self-kindness. So we have this idea that remember the worth of souls is great in the sight of God. And even since primary, yes, go ahead.
One of the things I just want to say, that in my practice, one of the things I'm finding with Latter-day Saint women in particular is that these messages that we just went through are so deeply ingrained that it just is a part of their being. And so part of what I need to do as a clinician is tease that out in such a way that doesn't necessarily speak badly about the church. And so I think there's a depth that has to go with all of that, and there's a trust in the therapeutic alliance that has to go with that. So I think I just want to add that because I think that's an important thing to recognize, is that this is deeply held. It's not something that we can just discussion and we're good.
Right, and I think that's why using what's already in our culture and in our doctrine to re-emphasize the points of self-compassion that they've already believed deeply, that they've already been taught, that they know is true. And I think those can really help them maybe even make more of a leap towards being self-compassionate and being kind to themselves. And so I think that's a really great point. And then from really early on, I know the first song that we sang to our children as they're going to sleep is I Am a Child of God. And so this is something that we're taught early on and can give us this sense of thinking about, just like everyone else, I am God's child and I am important to him. I'm not more important than anyone else. I'm just like everyone else, but I'm important. And another great one is patriarchal blessings. They're given just for us, and they can help us understand ourselves better, focus on the things that God's already recognized, that are strengths in us, and that someone else cares about us. And so those are some great ways to promote self-kindness. Yes, go ahead.
While we're talking about worth, I also wanted to share, this is what I deal with all the time in my private practice.
Right.
This as well. And one thing that's been really helpful, there was a talk by Sister Joy Jones, I think it was the October 2017 conference, where she talked about the difference between worth and worthiness.
Yeah.
And it was so helpful to see that your worth does not change based upon what you do or you don't do. But worthiness is completely separate. And she goes into a lot of detail to show examples of this, which just really helps clarify for a lot of LDS people that, if I do commit a sin or if I do something wrong, my worth is still intact. But yes, there are some things I need to do that will adjust my worthiness.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's great. There's so many more than these that we're talking about, but I'm hoping this spurs in your mind more ideas that you're thinking about from talks that you've heard or scriptures that you've read that you can bring in, and even asking your client, well, what other messages have you heard that aligns with this idea? Yeah.
Efficiency is another one. People will say, I'm not I'm a terrible person because I don't cook meals for my family and I don't keep my house up.
Right.
And efficiency is completely different from worth. And I take great pains to separate those two. And one man say, I don't provide well for my family. I'm a worthless father. And it's like, no, it has nothing to do with your worth. You're just not an efficient breadwinner. And that does not affect your worth.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another great point. Thank you so much for sharing all of your different ideas. It's great. And so another thing that we can do is dispel the myth of perfection so that we create this idea of common humanity. That the person sitting next to me has their own problems, their own ways they're suffering. They're not perfect either. And they may be going through the same thing I'm going through, or they may be going through something entirely different. But whatever's going on, this is one of the things that Kristen Neff says, is this is a moment of suffering, to just sit with that it's okay. Like, it's okay that I'm not okay right now and that I'm suffering a little bit. And so some ways that you can help with your clients in feeling not so alone is maybe looking into the scriptures or into conference talks to find other examples of when people weren't perfect, when they were average humans having an average experience. So this is Soraya right here. And do you guys have any ideas of what you could help your clients illustrate with Soraya?
Yeah, well, she had 2 sons that had great behavior and 2 sons that had horrible behavior.
Yeah.
You know, and then she had a husband that had visions and dreams and would tell people about these things.
Yeah.
You know, that would be really hard to swallow.
Yeah, so she had a really complicated life. Maybe in this day and age, you know, she had 2 sons that fell away from the church. Was she a bad mom? Like, she could have thought those same things. Yeah.
She also did fortune telling.
Yeah.
She said, my sons are dead and we're going to die because we're so old we can't take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
And it was just wrong. And
Yeah.
it's fortune telling.
Yeah, and we all feel that way sometimes, right? That like, this is never gonna get better. All my kids are gonna die, or we're never gonna get a job, or my kids are never gonna grow up, or they're gonna go to jail. You know, all these, we catastrophize, just like Soraya did sometimes, and that's just part of the human experience. So the same thing could be said with Nephi, or we have the woman taken in adultery. There's so many examples from scriptures where we have this human experience and that no one is perfect. This is from Elder Holland, where he says, there's been no one who's perfect except for Jesus Christ. So just reminding clients about that. So we kind of already talked about this, about setting aside time for reflection and self-care. But I think an important way to do this is oftentimes we already have built in that we're praying or that we're reading the scriptures, but maybe having clients focus on during those times of how to promote being more kind to themselves. Maybe searching in the scriptures to find more evidence of God's love for them, and then to apply that love to themselves, to try and be like God in being kind to themselves. To look at their patriarchal blessings, search them, find things in there that help them reflect on what kind of things they can be kind to themselves about, thinking about people in the scriptures and how they're also struggling and they don't always do the right things either. My grandma used to say to me, like, you're not so different. And I used to think, well, that's not a way to cheer me up. Of course I'm different. Of course I'm special. You're supposed to tell me how great I am. And then as I got older, I realized, no, that's really wise. Like, the thing that you're going through, other people are going through too. And recognizing that can really help us in being more self-compassionate. And so just this scripture I think is so great because I think we have a really hard time with this as Latter-day Saints. We need to make sure that all these things are done in wisdom and order. Don't run faster than you have strength. It's right there in the scriptures. We all need to be kind to ourselves, take a break. No one's perfect. And I think that's a great thing to remind our clients about. Okay, so we're going to share some personal experiences, and I think Sarah's going to go first with that.
And thank you to both of you for being willing to step up and lead that discussion. That was really great work that you did. And I also want to acknowledge one member of our research group is not here today. She had something that had been planned for a year that was a conflict and she could not make it, but she did a lot of work on these slides. Her name is Sylvia Lipinska. And she wanted to share a very, very personal, very raw story from her own life about how she was shown kindness and compassion by a bishop that enabled her to have self-compassion for a very, very difficult situation. So she has given permission. She's in fact asked for me to share this story in this setting. So I'm going to read her story. I came to the United States when I was 11 years old as a refugee from Poland during the Cold War. At age 12, I was repeatedly sexually assaulted by a 25-year-old man. At age 13, when I figured out that I was pregnant, my perpetrator took me to a back alley abortion clinic to have a late-term abortion. It was a very traumatic experience. And I met the LDS missionaries when I was 14. I was excited to be baptized and have all of my sins washed away, especially the sin of killing my 26-week fetus. However, I was too scared to tell anyone about the abortion, so I lied at my baptismal interview when the missionaries asked if I had had an abortion. I felt my sin was not washed away because I had lied. Overall, being a member of the church has been a great blessing in my life. Some teachings, however, have interfered with my ability to feel like a worthwhile daughter of God, especially the teaching that abortion is like murder. And every time I heard that, I was reminded that I had committed murder. At least that's what she had conceptualized in her mind. When I was 16 years old, I lived with a wonderful Latter-day Saint family who treated me like their own child. They did not know that I had had an abortion. All of the healthy patterns I have in my life today, I owe to that family. However, this family also taught me that if a person murders someone, they cannot be forgiven unless they die for their own sins. This put the idea into my mind that if I wanted to go to heaven, I would have to die for my sin. For years, I tried to figure out how I could make myself die so that I could be forgiven for killing my child. Because I couldn't find a safe and painless way to die, guilt grew inside me and weighed me down every day of my young life. At age 17, I had to go back to Poland to take care of my mother. While living there, I couldn't live with the guilt and resulting pain any longer. I decided to confess my murder to my priesthood leader. He was a mission president because in 1990 there were no bishops in Poland. I was very scared to confess and I expected to be excommunicated. Surprisingly, my priesthood leader told me that I had done the best I could in the situation and that the waters of baptism had washed me clean. He told me God loved me and was pleased with me and there was nothing I had to repent of. It was very comforting to hear him say that. I didn't have to be excommunicated for killing my child or lying at my baptismal interview. I could still belong. I could still have the support of the church that I loved and needed so badly. I was very grateful for my priesthood leader's words. He planted the seed of self-compassion in my heart. It would take time to grow, and I wouldn't forgive myself for another 7 years, but the seed was planted. And that was a very powerful story, and I'm sure that it touches some raw feelings in a lot of you, as it does for me, but it's just an example of some of the pain that so many people within our faith and our communities are suffering with and holding to them, and how self-compassion, how leaders who take a very kind, compassionate stance can enable those people to be able to be more kind and compassionate to themselves. My stepfather, who is now since passed away, was a bishop for many years, and he was a convert to the church, and he just had this way about him of just accepting whoever who came into his life and just wanting to make them feel good about themselves, and he just was a magnet for people that way. And he had said that, when someone confesses something to me, like, the next time I see them, I don't know what it is, but I just have forgotten about it. I don't even remember that part about them. And I think that's part of what made people love him so much, because he didn't put them in a box of being a sinner or having this big, thing there. He just hey, this is gone, and I love you for who you are. And so that was a wonderful kind of very self-compassion promoting leadership. And a couple of my, let's see, what time are we at here? I just want to make sure.
10:01.
Okay, maybe just, Vari, can you share your story? Is that okay?
Yeah,
all right.
So my story isn't as dramatic as that, but I think it's a common one for clients who come in a lot of times. So when I had my first baby, I was so excited to find out I was pregnant. I was so excited to be moving on to this stage in my life that I felt like I had been taught was what I was supposed to do since I was little. Like this was my divine destiny, right? And so she came and I loved her so much, but she was so colicky, and I was having such a hard time with just the day-to-day staying at home with a baby. And I thought, what is wrong with me? Like everyone around me is so good at this mom thing, and they love it. They talk about how much they love it, and I don't know what's wrong with me because I don't love it. And in fact, I would start to maybe find someone I thought was safe to share this with, and there was some pushback of like, well, how can you not love this? Like, what's, kind of the same kind of thing that made them a little bit uncomfortable and made me feel even more like there is something wrong with me. And so it just created a lot of depression and anxiety and just a lot of suffering that I think I would go to church and go to Relief Society, just kind of hoping that someone else felt the same way I did, would share their story. But I just felt like I just kept hearing like people, maybe they didn't read their scriptures 7 times that week. Or, it was just really scary for them to share something real and raw. And it was scary for me. I didn't want to share either. And so it made me later on, after I got stronger and was more self-compassionate, to realize that other people needed me to share. That even though that was hard for me to be vulnerable and say things, and maybe people would say, you're a bad mom, or you don't love your kids because you don't like staying home. I thought, no, I need to stand up and say, this is me, this is who I am. Like, I'm not perfect. I'm not the perfect mom. I don't love it. And I don't know if I helped anyone, but I think that when I heard other people express their vulnerabilities, it helped me feel not alone. And I think that's one way that we can really help in our community. So
I'm hoping that just through sharing a couple of those stories, it also kind of spurs you to think a little bit about the stories in your own lives and the stories that your clients have shared. These stories, I think stories can be very, very powerful. Narrative can be a very powerful tool for helping people to heal. And I think that just being mindful of some of the stories that our clients have had, the ones that promote self-compassion, and also being mindful of those, stories where self-compassion hasn't been promoted in our culture, can really help you and help them to like kind of think back to those times where there were strengths and they did find those strengths in their community, but also just really be a witness for them and to validate their experience where maybe they weren't heard or they didn't feel listened to. And also maybe being an advocate in our community and helping to train leaders and helping to bring their awareness into what messages they can use that can really promote self-compassion and help ease the pain. Was there a hand over here?
I just want to say, one thing that I have found that really, really helps, many of these individuals need permission to even think of the self. And whether they're LDS, men or women, Christian, spiritual, many of them know the commandments. The second commandment is love the Lord thy God. The first, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, might, mind, and strength. The second is like unto it. Love thy neighbor as thyself, not before thyself or instead of thyself. And by being given the permission to love themselves is the pattern with which they can love others. That's permission.
Thank you very much for sharing.
Just on a personal note, I was raised in a fabulous LDS family that had my parents had adopted that sort of perfectionistic, high expectation, low grace, cultural belief, which is not our doctrine. And honestly, for me, the biggest change has been as I've read the scriptures and I actually see the Savior interacting with his people. And to read books about the atonement, it is very clearly, to me, this problem is our culture, not our doctrine. And I think, just like you said before, so bring people back to the doctrine, bring them back to the truths that they do believe. Because it's a cultural thing. It's not our doctrine.
And I agree with that. I really agree that that's not like the doctrine. I think sometimes where it gets a little bit confusing is that sometimes I think, leaders are also people, who struggle with their own perfectionistic tendencies or maybe their own tendencies not to be as self-compassionate. So I sometimes think when a leader says something that's less self-compassionate less self-compassionate and less conducive to people being self-compassionate, when these messages are preached over the pulpit, it can be harder, it can be easily conflated, like, oh, that is the doctrine, that we're hard on ourselves. And so I think that's where it's hard, right? Because we have these messages, these really great messages of the atonement, of grace, and all these things are out there. but yet sometimes it's just hard. And I think it's important for us to keep reminding our clients that, hey, that is like the core, that's really the truest part of our faith and our religion, right? That's the core.
It's an investment in taking what's beautiful and tweaking it.
Right.
And so to me, to read that scripture where Alma the Younger, who is the son of a prophet, and pulling all of the membership of the church away with his tall tales about what his dad is up to, for him to have an instantaneous forgiveness experience, I mean, that to me, that is our doctrine, that all of that can be washed away the minute we turn our hearts.
And it's so wonderful that you have that right in the forefront of your mind. So you could easily, bring that to your clients. And I think that can be so, so healing and so promoting of self-compassion. Yeah.
I think it's important to let our clients know that there's a difference between doctrine and opinion.
Yes.
And because a lot of our clients will take everything over the pulpit.
Yes, exactly. And that's hard because, you do see, even in General Conference, you do see these messages of like grace and hope, and then you do see these messages of like, hey, get it together. And so it can be hard for people, like if you already have a tendency towards being very perfectionistic, you might latch onto the, hey, get it together message and think, oh yeah, I suck. And you need to also keep infusing that with, these messages of grace. And I liked how like, hey, it has nothing to do with your worthiness. You might be like encouraged to do something, but you're all worthy. I do want to just briefly, we're almost out of time, I do want to just briefly just touch upon what this study is, and then if we have time, we can go on with some more comments. So this is what we're proposing to do, and hopefully I'll be able to come back in a future year and tell you what our findings have been. But we'd like to interview approximately 50 women who identify as Latter-day Saints and ask them to complete that self-compassion scale, which you all completed. We'll probably ask them to complete the longer form of it, though. And then we're going to give them a semi-structured qualitative interview where they're going to discuss their perceptions of self-compassion and how they relate it to their faith and their gender role experiences. The reason why we're going to do women is just because, as I noted before, some of these higher rates of anxiety and depression and lower self-compassion tends to be found more with women, and also just because that's what I've studied before. And there have been, some studies in recent years and some discussions about LDS women especially and perfectionism. So we wanted to focus on that population. So just how do Latter-day Saint women describe their own self-compassion practices, if any, and their level of self-compassion? We're going to define self-compassion for them before we ask them these questions. What do these women perceive about their interpretation of and practice of their faith, if anything, that helps facilitate self-compassion? And what do these women perceive about their interpretation and practice of their faith that inhibits self-compassion? And how do they describe coping with these discrepancies? Like, what are they doing? Are they reaching out? Are they latching on to the atonement? Are they going to friends? Are they, all these different things might come out, I imagine. And especially if there's these doctrinal ideals surrounding gender roles and self-compassion components, how do they cope with this ideal of like being the perfect mother? How are they compassionate with themselves? What's the relationship between what they say and their self-compassion scores? So that's what we're going to look at. And we're hoping it can add to the literature base about self-compassion, gender, and mental health, and give information about how religious practices, and particularly religious practices that promote traditional gender role norms, may interplay with the development of self-compassion in women. And we hope it'll lead to bigger things. So that is our presentation, and it was just a little discussion with you all today, but I hope it was helpful, and thank you so much for your time and for being here. So.